There are some words you say that you can't take back. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. And you didn't realize it until it was already too late to pretend otherwise. I was 26 years old, sitting on my best friend's couch in a suburb just outside of Edmonton, when I said something that unraveled the next 2 years of my life. I wasn't trying to be honest. I wasn't trying to be anything. I was just trying to get a laugh. But sometimes the things you say to fill a silence end up filling something else entirely, something you weren't ready to name yet. Before I tell you what happened, I just want to say, if you've ever had a moment where a single sentence changed the direction of your life, leave the word unexpected in the comments, because this story is for you. My name is Nolan Baxter, and this is the truest thing I've ever admitted out loud. I met Scott Willoughby in the 7th grade, in the middle of a gym class where neither of us could climb the rope. We bonded over shared humiliation and a mutual distrust of anyone who took dodgeball seriously. By high school, we were inseparable. The kind of friends who didn't need to make plans because we were always just there, at each other's houses, eating each other's food, taking up space like we owned it. Scott lived with his mom, Catherine Willoughby, in a 2-story house on the west side of Edmonton. His dad had moved to Vancouver when we were in grade 9. There wasn't a dramatic story behind it, just a slow falling apart that Scott never talked about and I never pushed. So it had been Catherine and Scott for most of our teenage years, and by the time we were in our mid-20s, not much had changed. Scott worked in HVAC installation. I was finishing up a 2-year diploma in business administration at NAIT, and on Friday nights we still ended up on that same couch, watching hockey and eating whatever was easiest. Catherine Willoughby was not the kind of woman who blended into the background. She was in her mid-40s, worked as a social worker for the city, and carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that comes from spending 20 years talking people through the worst moments of their lives. She wasn't loud about it. She didn't perform competence. She just had it. This steady, grounded presence that made you feel like whatever room she walked into was suddenly a little more stable. I had known her since I was 12. To me, she had always just been Scott's mom, the person who kept the fridge stocked and asked about my grades and once drove us 2 hours to a concert when we were 16, and somehow managed not to embarrass us about it. That's what I told myself, anyway. It was a Friday in late October, one of those nights where the cold had finally committed to being cold, and you could hear the wind working itself up outside while you were warm inside, which made everything feel more comfortable than it actually was. Scott and I had been watching the Oilers game. Not a good game, the kind where you spend more time complaining about the coaching than actually watching, and we'd gone through most of a pizza between us. Catherine came through the front door around 9:30. She'd been at a work event of some kind, something she'd mentioned earlier in the week. She was still in her coat, dark hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back the way she usually wore it. And she looked, I don't know how else to say it. She looked like herself, but more so like she'd been somewhere that reminded her she was a person, not just a parent. Scott looked up and said something about how she was dressed up for someone who claimed she was just going to a low-key work thing. His tone was the easy teasing of someone who knew exactly how far he could push. Catherine laughed and said something back. I don't even remember what, and then she started heading toward the kitchen to put her things down. And I, without thinking, without filtering a single thing, opened my mouth and said, Honestly, you look better than half the women I've dated. The room went quiet in that specific way. Rooms go quiet when something true has accidentally been said. Scott turned to look at me with an expression I can only describe as, why are you like this? I laughed immediately, trying to backpedal into comedy. I just mean, I have terrible taste, so it's actually not that impressive. But Catherine had stopped in the doorway to the kitchen. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't laughing either. She just looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Thoughtful, a little amused, maybe something else underneath that, and she said, That's a very interesting thing to say, Nolan. I told her I was kidding. She smiled and said, I know. But she said it in a way that left a question mark at the end, even though there wasn't one. Then she walked into the kitchen, and I heard her filling the kettle, and Scott and I sat in silence for a moment, too long before he turned back to the TV and said, You're an idiot. I agreed with him. I agreed with him completely, but something had shifted, and I could feel it, and I didn't know what to do with that. The weeks after that were strange, in a way I couldn't explain to anyone, including myself. I kept visiting Skaz the way I always had, Nothing about our friendship changed on the surface. We still watched games, still grabbed Tim Hortons on Saturday mornings, still complained about the same things. But every time I was at his house, I was more aware of Catherine than I'd ever been before. Not in the way I would have been at 22, where awareness just means attraction. This was different. I found myself paying attention to what she said, listening when she talked about her work, the family files she was managing, the policy changes she was frustrated with, the specific exhaustion of caring professionally for people who didn't always want to be cared for. She was interesting. That was the thing I hadn't fully registered before. She was genuinely interesting to talk to, and I think I'd spent 15 years assuming she was background furniture, which made me feel like something closer to an idiot than my original comment had. I started staying a bit longer on nights when Scott had to leave early for work the next morning. Not by much, 20 minutes, half an hour, and it was always Catherine who'd say, "You don't have to rush off," when I was reaching for my jacket, and I would sit back down and we would talk. About nothing important, about everything kind of important. She asked about my program, about what I actually wanted to do with a business diploma, about whether I liked Edmonton, or whether I was one of those people who had always wanted to leave. I told her I didn't know yet. She said that was a more honest answer than most people gave. One evening in November, Scott had gone to bed early with a headache. I helped Catherine carry some grocery bags in from her car, because she'd pulled up while I was leaving and it would have been strange not to. We ended up standing in the kitchen while she put things away, and we talked for almost an hour. I'm not sure about what, exactly. Life, mostly. She told me about growing up in Medicine Hat, about choosing social work because she'd grown up watching people fall through cracks that didn't have to be there. She talked about the years after Scott's dad left, how she'd spent so long making sure Scott was okay that she'd forgotten to check in on herself. She said it plainly, without self-pity, just as a fact, and I remember thinking, here is a person who has been living at half volume for years and doesn't realize she deserves to be louder. I didn't say that. I should have. I just said that she seemed like she was doing all right, and she smiled and said, "Define all right." I drove home that night with the windows down even though it was November, which tells you something about the state I was in. Nothing happened. I want to be clear about that, because the story makes it sound like things were building towards something obvious, and in hindsight maybe they were, but at the time I genuinely did not know what was happening. I just knew I was looking forward to seeing her in a way that I had never looked forward to seeing Scott's mom, and that distinction felt important and also deeply uncomfortable. In December, I had a conversation with myself that lasted about 2 weeks. I went through every argument I could think of. She was 17 years older than me. She was my best friend's mother. I had known her since I was 12 years old. Even entertaining this was a disaster waiting to happen. I had no idea if anything was mutual, or if I was building a narrative out of a few long conversations and my own sonesliness. I almost let it go. I came close. But then one evening, right before the holidays, Catherine said something that made it impossible. We were the only two in the house. Scott was doing last-minute shopping, and she'd made tea, and we were sitting at the kitchen table with the kind of easy quiet that you don't get with most people. And then, not looking at me, just watching her mug, she said, "That thing you said in October, the joke." I told her I was sorry about that. She looked up. "Don't be. I've been thinking about why it stuck with me. And I think it's because you actually meant it." I didn't say anything for a long moment. She said, "I'm not trying to make this complicated. I just think it would be dishonest to pretend I don't know what's been happening the last few months." I asked her what she thought had been happening. She said, "People who are trying to figure out whether they're allowed to feel something." I exhaled. I think it was the first full breath I'd taken in 2 months. Then she said, "I'm not going to do anything about it. Scott is my son. Your friendship with him is real and it matters, and I am not the kind of woman who burns things down for her own benefit." She paused, "But I wanted you to know that I see it, and I think you should decide what you actually want before it becomes something you regret not saying." Then Scott came home with 4 bags of groceries and a story about a parking situation at West Edmonton Mall, and Catherine got up to help him, and the conversation was over. I told Scott 3 weeks into the new year. It was the hardest conversation of my life, and I've had some hard ones. I asked if we could go for a drive. We ended up parked by the river valley, which sounds more poetic than it was. It was -22. Neither of us could feel our feet, and the heat in my car was working at about 60%. but we stayed. I told him that something had happened, and that nothing had actually happened, and that I needed to tell him because I respected him too much not to. I told him I had feelings for his mom. I said it slowly and clearly, and then I waited. Scott didn't say anything for almost a minute. Then he said, "How long?" I told him I wasn't sure. Maybe longer if I was being honest with myself. He stared out the windshields at the frozen river. Then he said, "She's my mom, Nolan." I told him I knew that. He said, "This is genuinely the weirdest thing you have ever told me, and you once told me you cried watching a TELUS commercial." I told him the commercial was very emotional. He didn't laugh. He said he needed time, and then he got out of the car and started walking, and I sat there in the cold for a while before driving home. The months that followed were the loneliest I'd had in a long time. Scott didn't cut me off completely, but the ease was gone. He texted less. He canceled plans with vague excuses. When we did see each other, there was a carefulness to everything he said that hadn't been there before, like he was watching where he stepped. I understood it. I would have felt the same way. But understanding something doesn't make it easier to sit with. Catherine and I didn't speak beyond brief, polite exchanges at the times I did see Scott. She wasn't cold. She was never cold, but she was careful too, and I could tell she was giving Scott space to process without making it harder for him. I finished my diploma in April, got a job offer doing operations support for a mid-sized logistics company out of Sherwood Park. Decent salary, benefits, stable. I took it because I needed something solid under my feet, and because working gave me somewhere to put my energy that wasn't the mess I had made of my personal life. I moved into a bachelor apartment in the Glenora neighborhood. I started running, which I had never done before, because something about my life felt like it needed to be physically harder in order to feel manageable. I talked to my older sister on the phone more than I had in years. I didn't tell her everything, but she knew something was wrong, and she did what my sister always did, which was tell me that whatever it was, I was probably making it more complicated than it needed to be. She was right, I think. Most things are. The call came in June. It was a Thursday evening. I was making pasta and listening to the radio, which is the kind of specific detail you remember when something important happens around it. My phone buzzed and Scott's name came up, and I stood there for a second before I answered. His voice was different, quieter. He said, "Hey, you have time to talk?" I turned off the stove. He didn't ease into it. He said that he'd been doing a lot of thinking, and that he'd also been paying more attention to his mom than he usually did, and that he'd noticed things he hadn't let himself notice before. How she came home from work and the house was quiet and stayed that way. How she'd started going to bed earlier. How she answered fine to everything he asked about her life, and how he'd always accepted that answer because it was easier as asking again. He said, "I think she's been lonely for a really long time, like longer than I want to admit." I didn't say anything. I just listened. He said, "I'm not giving you my blessing or whatever, I'm not doing that. But I also can't keep freezing you out because I'm uncomfortable, and then come home to watch her eat dinner by herself and pretend that's fine." He paused. "You're my best friend, and she's my mom. But I know I can't keep doing this." I told him I was sorry. For all of it, for the way it had happened, for the conversation by the river, for the months of distance. He said, "Yeah, I know." And then after a second, "Just don't mess this up, either of us. The friendship or the other thing. I can't afford to lose both." I told him I would do everything I could. We talked for another hour about nothing in particular. The Oilers' off-season moves, his new work truck, a fishing trip he was planning for August. And by the end of it, something between us had loosened. Not fixed, not easy, but breathing again. I called Catherine 2 days later. I told her I wasn't sure what I was proposing. I told her I just knew that the last several months had been worse than they needed to be, and that I had spent a lot of time thinking about what I actually wanted, which she had told me to do, and that the answer I kept coming back to was that I wanted the chance to find out if what I felt was as real as it seemed, or whether it would dissolve the moment we actually tried. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That's a very careful way of asking someone out, Nolan." I laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd had in a while, and I told her she could just say no if she wanted. She said I didn't say no. Our first date was a Sunday afternoon in early July. We drove out to the River Valley trails near Terwilligar Park, walked for 2 hours while a warm wind moved through the cottonwoods, and talked the way we had in her kitchen in November, easy and honest, and without the weight of everything that had been hanging over us. She told me about her plans to take a week off in August and drive to Jasper on her own, something she'd been wanting to do for years. I told her about the new job, about what I was figuring out about myself now that I had some stability and some quiet. Afterward, we got burgers at a place she knew in Riverbend and sat outside and split a piece of pie and talked for another hour. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic. It was just two people being honest with each other in the middle of an ordinary summer afternoon, and it felt more real than most things had done in my life up to that point. I drove her home. We sat in the driveway for a while. She said she'd had a genuinely good time, which she delivered with enough understatement that it made me smile. I told her I had too. She said, "So, what do we do with that?" I said we figure it out. Figuring it out took time. More time than either of us expected, and I think that was the right thing, even when it was frustrating. There were awkward holidays. Christmas that year was a specific kind of strange that I don't think any of us have fully processed, even now. There were moments where Scott and I would be in the middle of a conversation, and one of us would reference something involving Catherine, and a silence would fall, and we would have to choose consciously to let it pass. But we let it pass. Over and over again. That's the work that doesn't look like anything from the outside, the choosing every time to stay. Catherine took her trip to Jasper in August. She sent me a photo from the Athabasca Glacier, just her standing there in the wind, squinting against the cold, grinning like someone who had been given permission to exist outside her own routine. That photo is still on my phone. I've looked at it a lot over the years. It has now been almost 3 years since that October night on the couch. Catherine and I are together, officially, deliberately, without apology. We don't live together yet, but we talk about it sometimes in the way people do, when they're waiting for the timing to feel right rather than because there's any doubt. Scott and I are still best friends. We still watch hockey together, still do Tim Hortons on Saturday mornings when we can, still have an ongoing and unresolved argument about whether Edmonton has ever been properly underrated. At Christmas last year, he made a toast at dinner that was 90% roasting me, and 10% something genuine, which is exactly how I would have wanted it. Occasionally, when the three of us are in the same room and things feel normal, actually unremarkably normal, he'll catch my eye and shake his head a little, like he still can't quite believe this is the life we ended up with. Honestly, neither can I. What I know is this. I said something careless on a Friday night in October trying to get a laugh, and what it did instead was say something true. Something I hadn't had the language for yet. And if Catherine hadn't stopped in that doorway, if she hadn't looked at me like she was actually thinking about what I'd said instead of dismissing it, I don't know how long it would have taken me to figure out what I actually felt. Maybe forever. There are things you say that you can't take back. I spent a long time thinking that was a warning. Turns out sometimes it's the whole point. If this story meant something to you, please take a moment to like the video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you've ever had a moment where one unexpected sentence changed the course of your life, leave the word unexpected below. Because those are the moments that make the best stories. And I'm glad I finally had the courage to tell mine.